So the chapter this week in our summer book study, out of which our ministers are preaching, Forrest Church's book, Lifecraft, the topic for this week was about death. And I did not want to preach about death this week. Had too much of it. However, when I brought the topic to our class on Wednesday night, it seemed like it was a worthy topic for our reflection, the effect that knowing our own mortality will have on how we live and love in the world. We had a really good conversation on Wednesday night. In class, we talked about the first moments when each of us in the room encountered the reality of death. When we knew that it was something that was going to happen to the people that we knew, and then when we realized that included us. People lifted up experiences where their family kind of hushed about it and didn't talk about it. Some families that had specific rituals and meaning behind it, but almost everyone in the room pointed out that it meant something to them now. Those initial memories, those initial lessons they learned from their family and their culture about what our mortality meant were sticking with them. Got me thinking to my childhood growing up just a few minutes down the road in Grand Prairie. My family encountered a lot of death as I was a young child and an adolescent, enough to where I got pretty used to the familiar rituals. So much that I kind of just imagined that everyone who died got buried in the same 2 or 3 cemeteries. Paging Dr. Freud. Talk to somebody about that. I had in my mind that when everybody died, they got buried at 2 or 3 of the same places. They were all in Grand Prairie, and you went to the Bean Massey Burge Funeral Home in downtown Grand Prairie. My expectation of death was that everyone had an open casket. You had a visitation the evening before, and that in a graveside burial in one of the few cemeteries that I'd ever seen a person be put into the ground, you'd be put right there. And because my family and all the related families had bought plots with our names on them, with tombstones with our names surrounding them, I would one day be in one of those exact same places. We had enough of this relationship with death that sometimes we joked about it. We knew people who died of old age and people who died of accidents, people who were killed in acts of violence far too early, and those whose deaths we couldn't explain. Some of us were weird about it. My grandfather and grandmother being 2 people. Big Ed was my grandmother's 3rd and 4th husband. And they bought their tombstones about 20 years before they died, with their names and their birth dates engraved on them. They would go to that cemetery and sit on a bench visiting their own tombstones for decades. Decades. And then, when Big Ed was ready, he had it engraved to say the words, "I told you I was sick." When my grandmother died, we attended the funeral and Ed was still living. We sat staring at the casket as it was about to be placed into the ground, uncontrollably laughing at a tombstone that said, "I told you I was sick." My mother got up and covered Ed's tombstone with a blanket, and we went on. I got mixed messages. But that class on Wednesday reminded me that those messages profoundly shaped what I imagine the reality of death and its meaning to look like. And that how we teach those messages to the people that are learning them in our lives is important. I had a moment just a few weeks ago, like the poet that I read from this morning, trying to explain a question about death to a young child. My son, Hank, had been reading a book about animals who have shells, and that if you found empty shells, the book said, likely the animal had moved on or died. We were reading the book as he was going to bed, and Hank said to me, "Oh, so those crabs died. That's sad." I said, "Yeah, it is. He said, "So are you going to die someday?" I said, "Yes, I am." He said, "That's sad." "Yes, it is." And he said, "So am I going to die someday?" I told my 4-year-old in his pajamas, "Yeah, one day." I wanted to do what the poet did and say, "Nope, we're going to be the only ones." But instead, I said, "Yes, one day you will." And then in a moment that just ripped me apart, this little kiddo in his PJs kind of held on to me and said, "But Daddy, I do not want to die." I didn't know what to do, but I knew that this was an important moment, that how I interacted with him was going to profoundly shape what he thought about his own mortality moving forward. That poem that Jane Kenyon wrote, "Otherwise," is one of my favorites because it addresses the very question, what changes about your life when you really understand that it isn't going to last forever? What changes? What's the effect? She wrote that poem, Otherwise, just as her husband, another poet, Donald Hall, was coming out of remission for liver cancer. They were staying at a family farm. They had just celebrated the fact that he was going to live when she was diagnosed with leukemia. So she wrote this poem while they were spending what she imagined to be their last days together. So when she says, "One day I know it will be otherwise," she means it. And that language is so stark and so true to me. One day it will be otherwise. She doesn't have to tell us what the effect is for her. You can tell she's grateful for breakfast, for a sweet, flawless peach and a bowl of cereal. She's grateful for a mate that she can lie down with midday. She's grateful for her pet that she walks around in the woods, and for her vocation and sense of work, knowing that it's not going to last forever. Now, being face to face with our own mortality doesn't always cause these moments of spiritual insight and wisdom. There's plenty of studies, actually, about how it affects human beings to mention death. Plenty of them show that if you do what I'm doing right now and mention our mortality and death in front of a group of people, you're more likely to engage in pro-social behavior after this. You'll be generous, forgiving, kind, you'll show up and volunteer, except the likelihood is that you will be pro-social to your in-crowd and less pro-social to them, whoever they are. You'll be more generous to causes that affect you and your family and your city, to our church, but probably less to those people out there. I watched this week, in response to the events, the killings of 2 more black men at the hands of police, and then the killings of police officers in our city, as the reminder of our fragility as human beings had the possibility of tearing apart a community and making more us and more them. I watched people struggling with that and doing what often we do, which is try and lean on some sense of permanency. I watched my colleagues quickly finding a way to be right about all of this. Everyone had to be a pundit on Facebook or even Twitter. Everyone had to make a statement. Everyone had to critique other people's way of responding to the tragedy, find the right language, find the right way of doing this, all within 24 hours of tragedies. I get it. When I'm uncertain and unsure and afraid, something in me wants to be right too, but none of us is saved by being right. At least not in this church. None of us is completely saved and healed and made whole by how much we can learn. Salvation by bibliography. Not in this church. But I also watched something that I know to be true, which is that the knowledge of our own fragility, of being small and sometimes out of control and temporary creatures, can also bring us together in profoundly impactful ways. I watched as our city refused to let itself be torn apart at the seams. I watched as our church community and others said we do not have to choose between a binary of supporting the work of the movement for Black lives and also giving thanks for people who protect us every day. I watched a community who said, no, I will not pick us and them. I will say that Black lives matter, and I will also mourn and grieve for the lives lost and give thanks for people who give dedicated service. I will give thanks for them and hold people accountable. I watched as our community thought about a more creative response, and our church showed up too. One of the most beautiful honors I ever get as a minister in this community is the chance to be with dying people, to be with your families as we mourn your deaths. If I'm around long enough, I will have the honor of being present with many of you in those moments. And dying people have taught me some profound lessons. One of the biggest is that the people who are often least afraid of dying are the dying, while the rest of us are having anxiety. In the majority of instances, people who are preparing to leave this world are the most calm, gentle, and composed about what's coming. I often know that we're getting close when a person who maybe isn't as lucid as they used to be starts using transportation imagery with me. A person who I'm at the bedside with starts telling me they don't like the way I'm driving. Or talks about being on a boat. That imagery comes up so often. They often speak of relationships and families. You know all of this. Seeing and being visited by people who have been important, and no matter what you think actually happens, what I know is that the majority of people I've been with in their final moments have entered into a place of rest and comfort that I'm not sure I yet understand. Now, death doesn't always do this. Not all your family grudges have been wiped away at an ill family member's hospital room. I know that. But I've seen it happen. Family dynamics shift. People who seemed hard-hearted and cranky almost all their lives become gentle and affectionate at life's end. I've watched something beautiful happen when we remember that this isn't going to last forever. That one day it will be otherwise. Our religion, liberal religion as a whole, was founded on the idea that religion isn't a set of truths that come out of the sky, immutable, that need to be affirmed or not. Liberal religion was founded by people who thought that religion was designed to explain a human sensation of dependence and finitude. There was this guy named Friedrich Schleiermacher. He's called the father of liberal religion, hundreds of years ago. And he said that religion is all about humans trying to describe what it means to feel like we are utterly dependent on the universe for our own lives. That each of us, somewhere in us, knows that we did not create ourselves, did not make the stars, cannot control the fact that we will one day lose our own lives. And so, in order to explain this sensation, we create churches and creeds and dogmas and rituals, he said. And the Unitarians and the Universalists thought he was right about that. That religion is designed to try and explain this sense that we all have, that we are kind of small, really dependent to live, and temporary. Forrest Church in his book describes that in his own words by saying, religion is the human response to being alive and having to die. See, our ancestors didn't think that being small and dependent and temporary was a bad thing. That didn't mean that we should feel shame because we were dependent on the universe to exist, that we were small. It meant that our primary religious response was one of awe. Friedrich Schleiermacher talked about laying down on the earth, getting your whole body as close to the soil as you possibly could, and lying on your back and looking up at the stars and realizing that you would not be unless all things were exactly as they are. For him, religion was about explaining awe, which only comes if we're temporary. And this week, in the response to the events of the last week and a half, feeling battered and tired of bad news, I asked if people on Facebook, of all places, would share with me experiences of awe. What gives you awe? I had a greater response to that question than anything I've ever posted. And I wanted to share a couple of the images with you today. One of my colleagues shared this with me from a recent sabbatical trip. She said, "I was in awe when I stared at him staring at me." One of our church members shared this. Those of you native to Texas will see the cicada emerging. I knew you'd do that. This is a member of our congregation's partner and their child, their infant child. One of the girls in our church whose parents said that she refuses to understand herself as a limited person right now, even though she's only 4 years old. And this is a tree growing out of what looked like a dead stump. You won't be surprised, I think, to learn that those images of awe, and they were 60, 70 images people sent to me on my email or on social media, usually had to do with nature, children, or human relationships. All things that anyone who knows those things knows are pretty out of our control, beyond our creation, and beyond our ability to sustain forever. This week, reflecting reminded me that the things that make life worth living, the things that actually make us healed and whole, the things that make us lay down on the soft soil and stare up into the stars with awe, are only possible if we are temporary people. How would we be in awe of the baby or nature or the stars if you and I were going to be around forever and could create all things? How could we experience grace being given to us or give it to someone else if we were perfect, immortal creatures? Why would we have the urgency to work for justice? The urgency to make it right and ensure a world that is fair and loving if we had forever to get it done? And love, that doctrine of our church, the central thing that holds this place in our faith tradition together. How could we love and cling tightly to those in our lives if we didn't know that one day it would be otherwise? For me, the things that make life worth living, the things that make life beautiful and awe-inspiring, the moments of grace and justice and love that I have are only possible if this whole thing is not going to last forever. I ended up being happy that the chapter was about our mortality. I think it's a good thing to know that this beautiful, wonderful, sometimes terrifying existence is not going to last forever. So my friends, whatever the world brings us right now, whether our situation is in fact terrifying or seems out of control or confusing, or whether you're knowing great beauty or love or pain, one thing is indeed true. One day it will be otherwise. So be very, very good to one another this day and all days. Amen.